Welcome to the New York City Bar Association. I'm Doris Toyou, co-chair of the African Affairs Committee at the New York City Bar Association. Thank you for attending this event on Cameroon, internal crisis and international impact, case of the Anglophone region. Thank you for the co-sponsoring committee, the International Human Rights Committee, and Cyrus Vance Center for International Justice. And I also want to thank the panelists, great panelists, for accepting this invitation, and also the attendee for being here tonight. Cameroon is a country situated in Central Africa, in the Gulf of Guinea, which obtained its independence in 1960. In 1961, Cameroon obtained its independence in 1960 from the French administration. In 1961, Anglophone who were in the British administration accepted to join French Cameroon to form a federation, the federation entitled the Federal Republic of Cameroon. In 1972, this federation was abolished unilaterally by the French Cameroon without any consent from the Anglophone to form a unitary state. Since independence, the Cameroon has been ruled by two presidents. The first president came into power in 1960, was handed power from the French administration, and he ruled until 1982. In 1982, this president resigned, and he also handed power to a president in November 1982, and this president has been ruling Cameroon from 1982 until today, almost 40 years. Cameroon is, as the media says, a country with a president who has a firm grip on power, which is another way to say that it's a dictatorship. This is just a way to describe things. Freedom of expression, reunion, demonstration often leads to imprisonment, months, years, and also can lead to death. And currently we have a lot of prisoners who was in prison just for expressing their opinion. According to the State Department 2022 Human Rights Report, the president of Cameroon ethnic group, which is represented by the group Boubou Beti, is this group, ethnical group, out of the more than 200 ethnical group in Cameroon, there's this single group who holds, who are represented in the entire administration, security force, including the army, state-owned business, justice, and finance. And in Cameroon, we often see a sort of a sponsor issue with racial tension, which in general are sponsored by the government, because for the experience that Cameroonians have, there's not really like a racial tension between Cameroonians. Tonight, the panelists will explore different aspects of the Anglophone crisis, starting with the issue of identify what is exactly the Cameroon crisis, what they call the Anglophone crisis. And the panelists also will explore the humanitarian issue that has led to the crisis, and also all the migration that has followed. Tonight, our panelists, our great panelists are Dibousi Tande, Professor Charlotte Walker Said, and also Tiongomu. Dibousi Tande is a political scientist, writer, and poet who lives in Chicago. His articles have appeared in a variety of print and online publications, such as Road Journalism Review, Focus on Africa magazine, Africa Writing Online. Dibousi is the author of No Turning Back, poem from Freedom 1990 and 1993. He's also a co-editor of That Champagne Party Will End, poem in honor of Abate Bissong. His poems have been published in several anthologies, including Treasure Poem of America in 1994. Dibousi is also the author of Scribe from the Den, essay on politics and collective memory in Cameroon in 2009. and he produces the award-winning blog, Scribe from the Den. Debussy blog at Twitter is a leading source of news and analysis on Cameroon. Debussy obtained a license in public law and a maîtrise in political science from the University of Yaoundé. He also holds a master's degree in science and instructional technology from Northeastern Illinois University, Chicago, and Northern Illinois University, DeKalb, respectively. He previously served as associate editor for Cameroon Life magazine and Cameroon Today. Our second panelist is Professor Charlotte Walker-Said. Professor Walker-Said is an associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. Professor Walker-Said is graduate with a PhD in history from Yale University in 2009, and before she earned an AB at Princeton University. Before coming at John Jay College, Professor Walker-Said was a Theodore Lentz Fellow in Human Rights at Webster University from 2012 and 2013, a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the University of Chicago from 2010 and 2012, and a visiting lecturer at Harvard University from 2009 and 2010. Professor Walker-Said research focuses on Christianity, law, and human rights in Cameroon and Central West Africa. Professor Walker-Said is also interested in application of human rights law and philosophy in techniques of corporate social responsibility in Africa. She is the author of a book entitled Faith, Power, and Family, Christianity and Social Change in French Cameroon. And she is the editor along with John D. Kelly of the volume Corporate Social Responsibility, Human Rights in the New Global Economy with the University of Chicago Press. Finally, our third panelist is Tion Gwomu. Tion is an Ethiopian-American attorney, writer, consultant, and researcher on migration with special focus on gender and sexuality. Tion is the legal manager of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, the first national immigrant rights organization for people of African descent. Tion is also the founder and director of a queer Black immigrant project, QBIP, a Black radical lawyering initiative which provides comprehensive legal representation to LGBTQIA and Black immigrants while creating a safe space for clients to regain control over their voices through a storytelling project. QBIP's mission is to create a systemic response to meet the legal and social needs of LGBTQIA and Black immigrants, while elevating narrative that illuminates the global injustices of state-sponsored homophobia and anti-Black racism. Tion has received recognition for work at the intersection of international immigration and racial justice by Preet Bharara and Cafe 100, changemaker taking action to address some of the most pressing problems in America and around the world. She was also selected in 2018 as the Forbes 30 Under 30 Law and Policy Honoree, OK Africa's 2019 Top 100 Women Honoree, NYU School of Law's 2019 Outlaw Alumna of the Year, and NYU School of Law's 2020 LACA Under 40 Rising Star. Tion holds a BA in Political Science and History with a minor in Human Rights and the University of Chicago. She also holds a JD from New York University School of Law, and she's licensed to practice in New York. Thank you very much for the panelists. And now,
thank you.
To leave the floor to Debussy, we're going to introduce what exactly is the Anglophone crisis.
Thank you, Doris, for that introduction and for those kind words. So I'll kick off this part of the show, with the webinar, by beginning to give us a brief background of the Anglophone crisis. How did it start? How did we get here? And we're going to do it in a way that is not too burdensome for the casual observer of the Anglophone crisis, but we're going to give enough details to have an idea of what it's all about. So give me a minute here. So the present conflict is rooted in Cameroon's triple German, British, and French colonial heritage. In 1884, the Germans set up the Protectorate of Cameroon, which lasted until 1914, when the territory was occupied by Anglo-French forces during the First World War. In 1916, Britain and France partitioned the territory, with Britain occupying 1/5 and France the rest. In 1922, the League of Nations confirmed this partition and established two mandate territories, Cameroon under French control and Northern Cameroons and Southern Cameroons, two geographically discontinuous territories under British control. While the French governed French Cameroons as separate from French Equatorial Africa, the British integrated Northern Cameroons and Southern Cameroons as part of the British protectorates of Northern and Southern Nigeria, respectively. So from there, you've got these two divergent paths. And after the Second World War, both territories, French Cameroons and British Cameroons, became United Nations Trust territories. French Cameroon gained its independence in 1960 and became known as the Republic of Cameroon. In 1961, the United Nations organized a plebiscite in British-controlled Northern and Southern Cameroons to determine the political future of both territories. The inhabitants were asked if they wanted, and I quote, to achieve independence by joining either the Republic of Cameroon or the Federation of Nigeria, which had gained independence in 1960. The option of achieving independence as a separate state from both of these countries was not included. Northern Cameroons voted to join or remain part of Nigeria, while Southern Cameroons voted to join the Republic of Cameroon. In October 1961, the Federal Republic of Cameroon was born, with Southern Cameroons becoming the Federated State of West Cameroon and the Republic of Cameroon becoming the State of East Cameroon. And even though the federation was a very centralized one, not the typical federation that we're familiar with in most countries, West Cameroon nonetheless retained the trappings of an independent state with its own ministerial government headed by a prime minister, a civil service, a house of assembly, a house of chiefs, a police force, its own educational system and court system based on the British common law. So the federation gave British Cameroons or West Cameroon a certain amount of autonomy, a certain amount of independence, in spite of the highly centralized nature of the federation. Now, this federal system of government, which gave this level of autonomy, was dissolved in 1972, when President Ahmadou Ahidjo abolished the federation through a nationwide referendum on grounds that the federation was costly, it was cumbersome, and an obstacle to national unity. Now, with the establishment of this highly centralized unitary system of government, all the constitutional provisions and institutions that had protected West Cameroon from the socio-political domination of the numerically superior East Cameroon were abolished. West Cameroon was split into two provinces, the Northwest Province and the Southwest Province, each headed by a governor appointed by the central government. And so with one act, the former West Cameroon or Southern Cameroon ceased to exist as a distinct constitutional entity, a situation that was different from what it had prevailed for the previous 50 years. And this is where a lot of people trace the beginning of the institutional or constitutional beginnings of the Anglophone problem as we know it today. The dissolution of the Federation set in motion a process of what has been termed the Frenchification of the Anglophone system and the political atomization of West Cameroonians who now became known as Anglophones. Not only were the Anglophones marginalized economically, culturally, and politically within the Francophone-dominated unitary state, they were also the target of relentless assimilationist efforts by the central government, particularly repeated attempts to suppress their official language and legal and educational systems. Despite this, Anglophones generally tolerated the situation. until the political liberalization movement of the 1990s that led to what has been termed a revival of the Anglophone nationalism and the emergence of a lot of Anglophone associations and pressure groups that call for a return to the pre-1972 federation or even outright independence in some instances. This revival placed the Anglophone problem squarely on Cameroon's political agenda throughout the 1990s, but it was never resolved. And instead of going back to the federation, the government adopted a new constitution in 1996 that promoted regionalism. Regionalism that still did not give Anglophones the amount of autonomy that they had before. So although the struggle for federalism or the establishment of an Anglophone state yielded no fruits in the 1990s, the flame of Anglophone nationalism never died out. As some have asserted, as the government continued its assault on Anglophone identity and culture, Anglophones resorted to less obvious manners of resistance, creating a unique public space for themselves where they promoted their identity and nationhood in historical, artistic, virtual, legal, and everyday domains. And this laid the foundation of the Anglophone revolt of 2016. And what happened in 2016? In November 2016, Anglophone lawyers and teachers launched a strike against what was termed the increasing Francophonization of the common law system and the Anglophone educational systems in the country. Working under the canopy of the Cameroon Anglophone Civil Society Consortium, the strike soon became a widespread protest against the systemic marginalizations of Anglophones within Cameroon, with the majority of protesters calling for a return to the federal system. The government response was brutal, violent, and unflinching. It banned the pro-federalist consortium and its allied groups and arrested its leaders whom it accused, among other things, of treason, terrorism, hostility to the fatherland, and even secession, which they were not calling for anyway. The muzzling of the consortium left the field open to a lot of marginal restoration or independence groups that were calling for the restoration of the state of Southern Cameroon. These groups argued that the term Anglophone crisis, as it was known then, was a misnomer because the conflict was not about language. Rather, they said it was an international conflict between two countries, Southern Cameroon and the Republic of Cameroon, both with internationally recognized borders, which stemmed from the illegal occupation and colonization of Southern Cameroon. So they insisted that the citizens of Southern Cameroon were not Anglophones, defined primarily by a foreign language, but a distinct people in their own right, with a common history, their own language or linguistic tradition, their own territory, and who identified themselves as a people. And they said the only solution to this problem was independence. Of course, the government, on the other hand, insisted that this was not the case. Cameroon was one and indivisible and vowed to protect the country's territorial integrity. So by the end of 2017, what began as a civil society organization protest had morphed into a full-fledged armed conflict between Amazonian groups and the government forces. The conflict has been very devastating so far. By the end of 2019, over 200 Anglophone villages had been destroyed or burned down. Over 500,000 Anglophones were internally displaced within the country. Close to about 60,000 registered as refugees in Nigeria. Thousands were dispersed across the world seeking refuge in places like Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico. Some of that, we'll discuss some of that, these migrant patterns during this webinar. And the economy of the region was completely devastated. And over 1 million Anglophone children were out of school. Close to 5,000 public primary and secondary schools shut down. And even more tragically, going by the most conservative of estimates, somewhere about 4,000 to 5,000 people had lost their lives. Some people put the estimates at even 15,000 or more. So that is where we are. That is where that conflict, that tense, that situation that began in 1972 with a change of a constitution, with the assimilation or the dissolution of West Cameroon, the former Southern Cameroons, where it has led us, where you have this irredentist movement of people trying to create a new state based on the configuration or the international boundaries that existed prior to 1961. I hope that that's an adequate summary of the situation and where we are right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So introduction of the Anglophone crisis, how the media are labeling it. We will probably have some questions to go more into details.
Definitely, there will be time for more questions and more in-depth discussions during the discussion part.
Thank you so much. Professor Walker Said, would like to have your thought on what are the consequences with your knowledge of Cameroon and Central Africa, and also the humanitarian consequences with the issue, the crisis that Cameroon has right now?
So I think that the most important issues to consider in terms of humanitarian crisis are, of course, first and foremost, the loss of life. So as Mr. Tunde explained, there's there's some uncertainty around how many deaths have occurred. A large number have been civilian deaths. And Human Rights Watch has been one of the most scrupulous organizations who is trying to tally, or at least trying to separate the deaths that were caused by military or security forces action and deaths that have been caused by separatist forces against civilians and against the military. So there have been some organizations who've been very scrupulous about trying to account for the death toll of each side, as it were, although there aren't extremely strict sides. Even among the separatist groups, there's divisions. So the separatists are not one united force in Cameroon. That's sort of one of the many impediments to peace. So the death toll is still uncertain, ranging from 5,000 to 10 or maybe even more thousand people. So there's that first consideration. The second consideration I think that must be mentioned is sexual violence. So there has been a lot of reports of systematic rape of Anglophone women by the security forces. I've read many fewer reports of sexual violence by separatist forces. It wouldn't surprise me if that was also occurring simultaneously, but it has not been reported to the same extent as sexual violence against Anglophone women by the security forces. And I think that's just really a factor of the increased and extremely heavy military presence in the Anglophone regions. So there are now literally hundreds of checkpoints and full military occupation of many towns and villages in the Anglophone regions. And so whenever you get a really high proportion of military servicemen in rural villages with populations with absolutely zero self-defense mechanisms, especially young women or older women who are doing a lot of traveling between farms, they're doing a lot of traveling for food, for resources, for trade, et cetera. So women are doing a lot of the traveling on foot, unaccompanied by any male guardians or escorts. And there's a really high military presence. So it's just almost inevitable that you're going to see a high rate of sexual violence. And so we have seen that in Cameroon increasingly in the past couple of years. So reports of rape, of abortions performed as a result of rape, of a need for medical attention of women who have been sexually violated. So that's, I think, a second humanitarian concern. The third is, and I think it's much more widespread and pronounced than just the death toll, is the displacement. So the UNHCR puts the displacement at around 750,000 people in Cameroon, which is enormous, right? That's just devastating. So you have a huge amount of displaced people, which far exceeds the death toll and just demonstrates how scared and disrupted people are. And when the majority of these 750,000 people are subsistence farmers or in some way dependent on local agriculture for their food security, you're going to see a lot of food insecurity. You're going to see a lot of nutritional need. And so the UNHCR has highlighted that there's a lot of food insecurity right now as a result of displacement. And there's also just a lot of there is a serious lack of communication as a result of displacement. Displaced people don't have access to plug in their cell phones, right? So I know a lot of people from Cameroon who can't connect with their uncles or their cousins or their mothers because they can't get in touch with them on their phones. People who are displaced can't easily access electricity. So you have you don't have the best communication flow from the displaced persons to people in other countries or in more secure areas who can then relay news and information to the world. So there is still kind of an information gap from the people who are experiencing the mass displacement to the people, an information gap between the people experiencing the displacement and the people who might be able to report on that. So I would put, again, the death toll, the rate of sexual violence, and the mass displacement as the most important humanitarian issues. I know that organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, has been forced to pull out of northern Cameroon, in the northwest region, as a result of separatist violence and military violence. So both the separatists and the military have attacked humanitarian organizations and have attacked their outposts as a result of perceived assistance. So the military has attacked and killed and beaten nurses and doctors in the Anglophone region who were suspected of treating or relieving the separatist rebels, and the separatists have attacked the humanitarian forces who they believe are reporting on them to the government. So there is a lot of insecurity with regard to humanitarian organizations. So I know Doctors Without Borders did pull out back in the sort of fall of 2020, and they may have reopened some of their areas, but the humanitarian situation remains very, very serious. And I think that right now the displacement is again, still severe, and we're still seeing what you might call sporadic and yet continuous violence. So there isn't necessarily like a massacre every week, but there are killings every week that are reported. And each of these killings is usually in some way, not just a wartime killing of, armed conflict or an armed skirmish. They appear more and more to be really unjustified extrajudicial killings. So the most recent one was a young man who was gunned down after trying to escape a police checkpoint, just killed, and after the fact was accused, or there was some evidence that was, quote unquote, evidence that was supplied that he was a separatist fighter. So there's a lot of evidence that seems to be brought out after the fact to justify a lot of killings of young Anglophone men. This is occurring with, I think, increasing frequency, that we just see extrajudicial killings that are justified by the military spokesman who come up with some paper evidence to demonstrate a justification for that act. But, kind of shocking levels of violence are continuing. And I find that just really disturbing that the government has not established any roadmap for peace, any peace talks, and has no intention, from what I can tell, of actually de-escalating. In fact, they keep escalating military presence. They keep escalating the harsh rhetoric, and they keep doing things like trying priests in military courts. So recently they accused a member of the Catholic clergy of supporting the separatists and brought him up on charges in military court. So whether it's legal acts, extra legal acts, the government is sort of pressing on with its counterinsurgency and is not committed to any political solutions, only military solutions.
Which is very unfortunate. Thank you very much, Professor Wako Said, for this presentation. Now, with all the displacement, there's also some displacement that are not necessarily obvious to people. And Sion will let us know exactly, with your experience, what do you see with Cameroonian traveling all the way through Cameroon, West Africa, until the border of US Mexico?
Thank you, Doris. It's an honor to be here with all of you today, creating space to develop a collective and deeper understanding of the conflict in Cameroon. I've personally learned some things today already, and consequently the various harms experienced by Cameroonians both inside and outside of the country. My colleagues have done an excellent job of explaining the origin and contours of the conflict in Cameroon. And as Doris indicated, I'll be speaking about my experiences as an attorney working with Cameroonian migrants in the diaspora and the challenges this population has experienced as a result of forced migration. I'll keep my comments centered on two broad areas, namely the incredibly difficult migration journey of Cameroonians to Mexico and the US, as well as the harms experienced by Cameroonian migrants in the US immigration detention facilities. As discussed by my colleagues earlier in this webinar, we've seen a rather large exodus of Cameroonians seeking safety and security in other countries as a result of many factors, mainly the ongoing conflict in Cameroon, which we already discussed in detail, as well as other factors, including uptick in anti-homosexuality legislation and various other country conditions that have left vulnerable groups such as women and children susceptible to, as Dr. Walker Said mentioned, sexual violence, as well as denial of resources and opportunities, psychological abuse, physical violence, and early marriage, just to name a few. As a result of these factors, there's been a steady increase of Cameroonian migrants making the harrowing journey overland from South America through Central America and into Mexico in an attempt to cross the US-Mexico border, and in some cases continue on to Canada. Although Central American migrants are most often in the spotlight and the population that is most often discussed in at least US media, many African and Caribbean migrants also transit through Latin America. And from the experience of myself and my colleagues, the majority of those folks are Cameroonian. Over the past 5 years, with the tightening of immigration controls in Europe, many Cameroonian migrants have looked to the Americas as a more viable and accessible destination when fleeing the ongoing conflict in their home country. It's often cheaper to fly from Africa into South America rather than North America. Additionally, the US began blocking travel from certain countries, including recent visa sanctions against Cameroon, thus making direct travel to the US extremely difficult or impossible for certain populations. Oftentimes, Cameroonian migrants first enter South America through visa-friendly countries like Ecuador and Brazil. For example, I think prior to August of 2019, citizens of Cameroon, Ghana, and the DRC could enter Ecuador without a visa and stay for up to 90 days legally. After entering South America, migrants often progress north to Mexico, sometimes with the help of smugglers, also known as coyotes, or the aid of for example, social media posts of those folks who have gone before them. This overland migration route usually originates in Brazil for folks who don't have access to Ecuador, then Peru, then Ecuador, followed by Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala, to finally reach Mexico. And the transportation methods that folks use typically include a combination of buses, private cars, and walking on foot and boats. The complete journey from Brazil to Mexico can take anywhere from 2 to 4 months or possibly more, depending on immigration regulations in the countries that folks are passing through, which I'll speak to in a moment. This journey can cost anywhere between $2,500 and $13,000 US dollars, depending on your negotiation skills and the number of travelers in any one group. So you can imagine how difficult that is for folks to gather that sort of money, especially in the midst of an armed conflict that they had fled from their home countries. I think the most dangerous part of this journey is crossing the Darien Gap, which is a jungle on the border of Colombia and Panama. The gap is dominated by armed groups as well as drug traffickers, and migrants also have to safely navigate the natural dangers that exist when trekking through the jungle, like venomous snakes, like dangerous wildlife, starvation, and flash floods. Another difficult part of this trip is the need to enlist the service of smugglers, which I spoke about before, sometimes in multiple countries, who can charge as much as $1,500 US per person. Migrants also have to be wary of smugglers who may rob and abandon them or even rape and kill them, which we have vast documentation of both from Human Rights Watch and smaller Mexican-based organizations like AMUMI. Baji has also done some reporting of the experiences of Black migrants traveling through these countries. As with other migrants making this journey, even after the Darien Gap, Cameroonians face significant harm when making their way through Central America to Mexico. The violence faced by migrants typically begins in their home countries. As we know, Cameroonians have experienced various human rights abuses in their home country, which have only heightened over the past 4 years of armed conflict, and unfortunately continue to experience human rights abuses during their transit through Central America into Mexico while crossing the border, and even upon arrival at their destination. Cameroonians traveling through Central America confront various forms of violence, including racialized violence, as well as gender-based violence, like rape and sexual assault. Language and cultural barriers increase the vulnerability of Black migrants and Cameroonian migrants specifically throughout the migration route. In light of this major uptick in Black migrants traveling through Mexico to seek asylum in the US, my organization, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, expanded its legal services to Black migrants traveling through Mexico, in addition to the many Black immigrants that we serve in the United States. So since 2018, we have hosted monthly asylum support workshops in Tijuana, through which we provide information about the constant changes in asylum law in the US, incredible fear interview prep for Black migrants. Despite the border closure last year, these asylum support workshops are ongoing and continue now in digital form, as many Black migrants have been trapped in Mexico for over a year now, and some for several years. In 2019, the US and Mexican administrations began working together to externalize US immigration enforcement into Mexican territory. So border outsourcing has since increasingly become the form of border enforcement that is most widely utilized. So these days we find that it has become sort of all about pushing border enforcement out into other countries. This decision to externalize border enforcement resulted in thousands of African migrants, the majority of whom were and continue to be Cameroonian, being stranded in the southern Mexican city of Tapachula from mid-2019 onwards. It was difficult or impossible for Mexico to deport Cameroonians back to their home country, yet immigration officials would not permit them to travel north to the US-Mexico border. So at this same time, we made the decision to move our legal workshops into Tapachula, where many Black migrants, the majority again of whom were Cameroonian migrants, were trapped in Tapachula, Mexico. And what happened from there was that Black migrants organized, which is what we typically do in our home countries or outside of our home countries. And the Assembly of African Migrants was formed in Tapachula, which is a collective representing over 3,000 Black migrants, including men, women, and families from many African countries. And the Assembly released a powerful statement outlining their demands and coordinated press conferences and several protests to highlight both the conditions in their home countries as well as the harm that they were experiencing in their migration journeys to the United States. In addition to lifting up the demands of the Cameroonian-led assembly, Baji also organized delegations to bear witness and engage in legal advocacy and document the human rights abuses experienced by Black migrants traveling through Mexico. And this included, in large part, the experiences of Cameroonian migrants in Mexican immigration detention facilities who were severely beaten by officials, subjected to verbal and psychological torture, medical neglect, discriminatory food rationing, and various other abuses. All of this is in Baji's joint report with Amumi titled, "There is a Target on Us, the Impact of Anti-Black Racism on African Migrants at Mexico's Southern Border." In this report, Adamo, whose name has been changed for security reasons, a Cameroonian migrant living in Tapachula in 2019, expressed, "We pass through oceans in great hardship to arrive here, and look at how they welcome us with hate and racism." Unfortunately, for many Cameroonian migrants, the experiences of anti-Black racism did not stop in Mexico. Increasingly, individuals in US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, detention are Black and specifically Cameroonian. The complex network that ICE utilizes for detention has a long history of human rights and due process violations, sometimes that end with tragic and deadly repercussions. In this context, the broader context of mass incarceration in the United States, Cameroonian immigrants face really egregious conditions. These concerns are often, missing from the public's understanding of immigration and specifically immigration detention. To highlight one major issue, in 2020, US immigration officers tortured Cameroonian asylum seekers to force them to sign their own deportation orders in what was ultimately just a scramble to get African migrants out of the country, running up to the 2020 elections. So many Cameroonian migrants refused to sign these deportation orders, fearing death at the hands of Cameroonian government forces. And because they had legitimate asylum claims and pending hearings. According to multiple accounts and complaints filed by legal service providers in the US, detainees were threatened, choked, beaten, pepper sprayed, and threatened with more violence to make them sign these orders. Several were put in handcuffs by ICE officers, and their fingerprints were taken forcibly in place of a signature on documents known as stipulated orders of removal, by which asylum seekers sort of waive their rights to further immigration hearings and accept deportation. It is our belief and the belief and understanding of our colleagues that because Cameroonians make up the largest share of immigrants from Africa and Black immigrants generally, they're being disproportionately victimized by our immigration system. Baji's partners at the Center for Constitutional Rights, I see some of them are here today at this panel, as well as the Southern Poverty Law Center and Project South, are working to learn more about Cameroonian asylum seekers who were tortured and forcibly deported from the US in 2020 despite having viable asylum claims. Advocates in the US created a coalition known as the Alliance in Defense of Black Immigrants to stop future deportations and stay in contact with and support people who've already been deported, and to seek protective status for people from Cameroon. Advocates from the coalition submitted what are known as Freedom of Information Act or FOIA requests to learn more about who was on the 2020 deportation flights and why the flights occurred despite the fact that Cameroon is clearly experiencing an ongoing civil war. Baji and the American Immigration Immigration Council are also filing separate requests for information about the conditions, treatment, and outcomes for Black immigrants in 8 immigration detention facilities throughout the US South, which basically seek information about complaints and grievances and records related to documented incidents like those of the Cameroonians who were tortured and deported, as well as records on officials using force, chemical agents, weapons, and other devices against individuals in ICE custody. We know that Black immigrants, and especially Cameroonians, are experiencing serious harm in detention, which includes physical and verbal abuse, as well as the denial of medical and other necessary care. And we're really working our hardest to expose those harms. I just want to end on a slightly positive note, if possible. I think that while many of the stories that we hear from Cameroonian migrants are horrific and heartbreaking, we're also really inspired by their resilience and courage to fight and continue to defend international human rights norms. It's our hope that everyone joining this webinar today has the same conviction and sort of fighting spirit when it comes to defending the human dignity and human rights of Cameroonians and Cameroonian migrants negatively affected by the ongoing conflict, as well as harmful US policies.
Thank you, Sion. That's very inspiring. And I'm sure that, I mean, we have to publicize Baji more so that Cameroonian who are affected knows more about the organization, and they can contact your organization since you are doing ongoing things, ongoing action to all the incidents that happened with ICE last year. And I guess I still have some consequences. So I'm going to check if we have some Q&A. The audience, please, if you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to weigh in and ask your question, because I prefer that the audience has asked the question instead of myself. But since so far I see no question, there's something Debussy I'd like to understand. I mean, how is the conflict is right now in terms of, because you went through Ambazonia. What is Ambazonia exactly right now?
Well, Ambazonia, as I said before, is the name that separatist groups or independentist groups in southern Cameroons or Anglophone Cameroons, however you call it, give to that territory that was previously the British Southern Cameroons. This name was coined in the mid-80s by a prominent Anglophone lawyer, von Gojidinka, who named that territory Ambazonia. And this was after President Paul Biya changed the name of Cameroon, because after the federal system was put in place, the country was called after the dissolution of the federal system, the country was called the United Republic of Cameroon. And in 1984, Paul Biya said, well, we've attained national unity. So we're gonna call this country the Republic of Cameroon and take away United. Because United, that's right. Well, coincidentally, the Republic of Cameroon was the name of the French section before reunification. So Gojidinka, a lawyer, said, well, this is an act of secession. The French Cameroons have seceded from the Union, and we're creating our own state called Ambazonia. And that is how the name Ambazonia came to be. And for years, the name was dormant. You had, even in the 1990s, the prominent name was Southern Cameroons. That's why you had the SCNC, Southern Cameroons National Council, and a lot of groups that refer to themselves as Southern Cameroons. So it's until the Anglophone revolt of 2016 and 2017 that the name Ambazonia got a boost and came back to the fore. And basically all the independentist groups use that name or refer to that country as Ambazonia. And that is how Ambazonia came to be. And that's how it's the dominant theme. No one, or very few people use Southern Cameroons, but in the 1990s, Southern Cameroons was the term, but now it's Ambazonia. So that's how that name came to be.
Okay, thank you, Deepsy. I have a question, And I think that would be for you, Professor Walker Said. The question is, can the French government exercise influence in an effort to resolve the conflict? I'm thinking about you on that because I remember you were one of the signers of a letter that went through in 2000, 2 years ago, where a lot of persons wrote a letter to the French president asking to intervene to stop the conflict. What would you say if there's any possibility that the French waiting to resolve the conflict? You're on mute. You're on mute.
That's a great question. Thank you. That's a really good question. The French government has an enormous amount of leverage in Cameroon, and it can and is able to exert influence, especially when it comes to military affairs. So France provides almost the entire military budget of Cameroon. Cameroon pays for that in a sense, in that there's a lot of exports to France, and France receives some sort of favorable trade terms with a lot of primary products that come out of Cameroon, like timber, iron, things like that. So France definitely benefits economically from its relationship with Cameroon, and then kind of in a cooperative agreement also provides military assistance. So helicopters, weapons, etc. France provides the great majority of it. Cameroon has also purchased a number of military hardware pieces from the Emirates. So recently making big purchases of military hardware in the Emirates. They claim that they're using this advanced military technology to fight the war against Boko Haram in the north of Cameroon, but those pieces of military hardware have been spotted in the Anglophone regions. So it is very clear that this is not just a counterterrorism military hardware purchase, but in fact it is being used to suppress internal insurrections or even civil rights movement, as the Anglophone movement did start as a civil rights movement. It evolved into an armed movement, but many Anglophone people don't support that. Many Anglophone people I speak with do not support the armed insurrection. They supported the nonviolent civil rights movement for greater political rights and cultural rights for Anglophone people. And that movement, which is really the grassroots movement that represents a greater proportion of Anglophone people, that's really being suppressed using military counterinsurgency with, again, hardware purchased from the Emirates and France. So France could exert a lot of influence if it wanted to, much like in Chad. France is very close to the president of Cameroon. And often exhibits their closeness by attending things like, state ceremonies, funerals, weddings, etc. So France has shown extremely little interest in resolving this Anglophone conflict. France is extremely committed to francophonie and the whole concept of French influence, of French language, French law, French education, a kind of closeness with the francophone world. And so, in fact, the very nature of this conflict, as it does have this cultural root in the again, the grassroots expression of Anglophone people to not be Francophone, to not be French speaking, to not follow French law and the French civil code, and rather use the Anglophone sort of British common law system. Teachers and lawyers were at the forefront of this movement, arguing for cultural rights based in a heritage and a legacy of applying sort of British origin, but now Anglophone African cultural and legal norms. And the French government is completely uninterested in supporting that kind of movement. I mean, they're philosophically opposed to the idea that Cameroon would pay greater respect to their Anglophone counterparts or their Anglophone citizens. And so the French government is literally philosophically uninterested, at the very least, opposed, perhaps more specifically, to the Anglophone movement itself. So they have shown no interest in resolving this peacefully and see the Anglophone separatist movement as a terrorist movement. They're willing to side with the government of Cameroon in calling the separatists terrorists. In the defense of the government of Cameroon, those separatists do use terrorist tactics, but they are very different from other kinds of internationally backed terrorist groups that operate in the Sahel. But the French government has, agreed that the Anglophone movement is a terrorist movement and backs the Francophone government entirely in its counterinsurgency in the Anglophone region. So that that has certainly been one of many, many impediments to the peace process, is the fact that Cameroon is a client state of France, and France has backed Biya in his push for Francophone identity in Cameroon.
It's cultural, but it's not also because, I mean, the oil, I think, is also based in Anglophone region also. There's also a lot of economic issue that France has in this region, which might also explain why, I mean, beside the cultural effect of it, the control of resources. Who would you say? Maybe Professor Baba Said or Dibusi, what would you say?
Yeah, I think the resources issue also counts. And that has always been a long-standing argument. If you go way back to the 1990s, when Anglophones started talking about federalism, and the first cry was, no, federalism is the first step to secession in order to control the oil in the Anglophone region. And this theory was supported by the French government. And that is why even till today, the French government doesn't talk of federalism. It talks about regionalization or une large décentralisation or something along those lines. So it doesn't buy into the federalism argument, which has been a standing argument for Anglophones, both moderates and radicals, going back 30 years. And it's because of the resources. So definitely, like the professor said, Cameroon is a client state of France. France wants to have a stranglehold on all the resources, particularly the oil and the gas fields along the Bakassi Peninsula, the Diane, Rio de Rey, and all those areas. So that comes into play, and that is why France will never be an honest broker in this conflict. I would say France is a partner. It's a partner in this crisis. It's a participant, an active participant in this crisis. So if we're looking for a solution from France or with French help, it's not going to happen.
And it's very interesting that you are talking about an independent country, but we're talking about external power to resolve a problem of a country that is supposed to be independent. So that gives you exactly the state of what Cameroon is, actually a colony. I mean, that's just stated. I mean, it's just a way to describe a country that is not really, really, really independent, you know? So it's really interesting to see that. I mean, we have an internal conflict, and then we start to see that Cameroon has some international partner, and we want to see who can broker the deal, because, I mean, people are dying literally. But it doesn't seem that it's so interesting for a partner of this country to resolve the human issue. We have to note that the Cameroon crisis, Anglophone crisis, is the second most. It was the first one last year, but now it's the second humanitarian crisis most neglected in the world, which is very heartbroken to look at this. And we are talking about arms and military equipment that are sent to this country. We are talking about a cultural heritage while people are dying, which is something that I think is very, very, I won't say interesting, but is, let's say, pretty sad.
You're correct.
Yeah, I think it's important that the lack of political autonomy is in of itself a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're looking at Chad, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, the fact that these states have such strong ties to France, and France has a stranglehold on a lot of the resources, and such close ties with authoritarian leaders, is a source of insurrection in of itself. So the insurrection movements are provoked by the French clientelism. And then the French clientelism, you know, then further enables and encourages the authoritarian governments to crack down against these insurgencies, which are inspired by the very clientelism that sort of is cracking down against them. So it really is a very vicious cycle. The lack of true political autonomy for at least many of the Francophone African countries has really been devastating for internal security. And of course, for the greater stability of the region. It's deeply problematic. And if you look at France's behavior right now sort of trying to end Operation Barkhane in Mali and in the Greater Sahel region, we start to see France having some, perhaps, some second guesses about their military strategy in the region. I don't know if this will actually lead to significant policy adjustments, but they're trying to I wouldn't say de-escalate, but sort of remove some French military presence from the Sahel. Again, we'll see if this is a really concerted, significant policy change, or if it's just window dressing to appear as France is less present in the region. I myself am not convinced that this is some real soul searching on the part of Macron. I mean, Macron attended the funeral of Idriss Déby for a reason. He was publicly out in front at Idriss Déby's funeral, demonstrating that he would then lead not so much the transition, but the continuation of the Déby regime into the hands of Idriss Déby's son. And so, we see Macron in many ways being a handmaiden of these, regimes in West and Central Africa. And I just don't know what it would take for there to be a significant shift away from that, which might allow sort of the Anglophone movement to have a real breath, to actually perhaps develop a more sort of political solution-based framework or roadmap towards peace. Right now, the insurrection is very active and is also just very motivated to continue this struggle as the government continues to try and enforce its presence in the region.
Yeah, like you said initially, there's no de-escalation from the government, not a little tiny something like a dialogue. So, I mean, the other part also will react accordingly. Unfortunately, this is lead to escalation and even more violence. We have a question here for Mr. Diboussi. Can you speak more about the 2016 protest purpose, strategy, and demands? Is this, the question has disappeared. Anyway, the question was if you can speak more about what was exactly the 2016
protest.
Yes.
Well, the 2016 protest, I think we should even go 1 year back, because in May 2015, 1 year before, common law lawyers, Anglophone lawyers met in Bamenda and came with this resolution or statement about the Francophonization of the legal system, but it went beyond that. It also touched on the form of the state, because they felt their issues were much broader and that they touched on the entire Anglophone community. And in that memorandum, they actually called for federalism. I know the general narrative is that Anglophone lawyers called for a change in the laws, and then suddenly the change comes and they started talking about politics.
Yeah, the change came, what, 20 years later?
So the bottom is actually from 2015, the lawyers asked for the common law system to be respected, but said that could only happen within a federal system, a two-state federal system. And they gave the government 6 months to respond. The government ignored them, and they gave more time, and the government ignored them. And that's when all of this crisis started building up by around June of 2016. And it came to a head in November 2016, when the lawyers took to the streets and said, well, we want our demands now. And that was the first time when the police used violence. And it changed the nature of this stuff. It was followed immediately by violence at the University of Boya that was filmed and shown all over social media, and it changed the dynamic. So even though the lawyers, and then by then the teachers had joined the conflict or the protest movement. So at that moment, a conflict that was really limited to teachers and lawyers became a widespread movement. And at that point, there was no leadership, there was no broad-based goal about creating a state or whatever. And that is why the consortium was formed, because they suddenly discovered that all these disparate groups had different goals. But the population was also getting restless and making wide demands that went beyond what the teachers and the lawyers were asking. And that's when the consortium was formed to create a kind of convergence of all these ideas, the corporate demands and the institutional demands on the state. And the government quickly realized that this was snowballing into something much larger, which they couldn't control. And that's why it stepped out so fast to crack down on the consortium and arrest its leaders and accuse them of secession and treason and everything else. So yeah, 2016 was really the base, it was the beginning, I call it, of the second Anglophone revolt. Because in the 1990s, we saw basically the same thing, but it wasn't this in-depth. It was more of an intellectual exercise with a lot of conferences, a lot of memoranda, but this was more a lot of strict action. So it was a continued, yes. Mm-hmm.
1993, 1994, first All Anglophone Conference, second All Anglophone Conference. I mean, 2016 was just a continuation because
that's right.
Anglophone, I mean, a lot of people, observers would say that Anglophone has made so much effort with the Francophone. You know, they have given time and time and time. And I mean, right. It's not really surprising for people Cameroonian to see, and if especially if you are Cameroonian, you see the discrimination, because it's also something about discrimination that Anglophone Cameroon have faced. Because something that we haven't discussed here is that since 1961, Anglophone have joined French Cameroon. But the first Anglophone where they were speaking English university was in the 90s. So an Anglophone who was studying in Anglophone region wanted after to go to the university, has to go all the way to Yaoundé, because even at the 90s, there was only one university for the entire Cameroon. But at least the other was speaking French. But Anglophone was speaking English. They had to go, and if your French wasn't that good, it was also something very, very difficult for an Anglophone to just get by in your own supposedly country. So 2016, yes, I mean, it's just an explosion of so many things that happened before.
That's right. An explosion of pent-up anger that had built over the years. That's right.
Exactly. A question that I will have, let me see the panel, but I have a question for can UN, USA, before going to the question of Lucian, I have a question for Sion. How is the situation for Cameroonian migrant? I mean, I know that there's a lot of migrant right now in the border, but has something changed with the new administration? Because we were hearing that when the new administration came, there was a lot of people were saying caravan at the border. And I know that a lot of Cameroon were stopped and blocked at the southern border of the southern of Mexico. Has something changed right now for Cameroonian? Are they still here, or most of them have been deported?
So as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, a number of Cameroonians that were previously being held in detention facilities across the country in the United States were deported in fairly large numbers before the end of the Trump administration.
I think that we have a technical issue. Hello?
Yeah, Doris, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So as I was saying, there were a number of Cameroonians who were held in detention facilities across the country that were deported in large numbers towards the end of the Trump administration. And there continued to be deportation flights back to African countries, including Cameroon. With respect to the situation at the US-Mexico border, unfortunately, many migrants were Tapachula for an extended period of time, and then finally arrived at the US-Mexico border, where they were subject to a process that is known as metering, by which you receive a number and you wait until that number is called to be allowed to be processed into the US to make your asylum claim. And as folks were waiting under metering, the border closed due to COVID-19 and what we know now as the Title 42 policy, which uses public health concerns as reason to shut down the border in the United States. And so due to the Title 42 policy, Cameroonians and other migrants continue to wait in Mexico to be allowed to enter the United States. And this is compounded after being waiting in various parts of Mexico to even access the border. So there really has not been any movement with that. There has been a lot of advocacy on the part of several organizations throughout the US to allow folks to enter the United States, especially as we see certain populations that were subject to a separate policy known as the Migrant Protection Protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policy, by which folks were forced to remain in Mexico while their immigration cases were pending. Those individuals are now, that program is being, or has wound down, and those individuals are being processed into the United States. However, African migrants who were not subject to MPP and were simply subject to Title 42 are not allowed to enter the United States and are continued to be held in Mexico due to public health concerns. And so that sort of disparate treatment of different groups is certainly cause for advocates to continue to press on the issue of the Title 42 policy and to allow migrants, especially Cameroonian migrants who have been held in Mexico for quite some time, to be allowed to enter the United States.
Thank you. So Cam, a question for, all Debussy or Professor Walker Said, can UN, US or other organizations have a possibility to stop this war in Cameroon? If yes, what do they have? What are they waiting for? There are already many deaths. It looks like not other nations in the world did not want to help stop it or to put themselves on it. This is a question from Lucian. Who wants to?
Professor can go ahead. I can add in.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Terrible. Okay. I would say that, even the Trump administration spoke out about the conflict in Cameroon. So President Donald Trump, in a speech, which was announcing the end of a trade treaty with Cameroon, used the term human rights and used the word torture, human rights violations and torture. So Donald Trump used the words explicitly, human rights violations, systematic persecution and torture, in his speech announcing the end of favorable trade terms with Cameroon. And so our government has, again, excluded Cameroon from a trade treaty. Senator Jim Risch and the U.S. Committee on Foreign Relations has issued, several statements condemning the government of Cameroon. So I wouldn't say our government has been dramatic or forceful, but we have sent, Senate delegations. There have been committee resolutions. Former President Trump, again, did take action, at least an economic action on this. So there hasn't been no attention to this matter. The Cameroonian government just has shown absolutely no change in policy. None of these measures, none of the visits by the American delegation to the country, which was I think in 2019, summer 2019, the recent statements by the U.S. Committee on Foreign Relations, the ending of a trade treaty, none of this had any effect at all. The United Nations has, again, issued periodic statements on the humanitarian crisis, has called on Cameroon to engage in peace talks. The Catholic Church has become involved with the Pope mentioning this, and several Cameroonian bishops coming together, Anglophone and Francophone. Well, mostly Anglophone. This is sort of another issue. The Francophone bishops have actually not been as engaged as you might like them to be. The Anglophone bishops have actually been much more active in calling for peace and negotiations. The Francophone bishops, in my opinion, could be a little bit more vocal about this. But the Catholic Church, again, in the Anglophone region has been very active about this. So there have been calls, for negotiations, for de-escalation, for peace talks. and the Cameroonian government is not budging. Paul Biya is, I think he's 88 years old. If he's not 88, he's 87. He's like in there. He's been in power since I was born, since 1981. He is resistant. He is very resilient and resistant to members of the International Committee calling on him to change his tactics. He has not once hosted a free and fair election. He has not once responded to calls for democratization or free and fair elections or anything like that. So while we would like the United States, the United Nations to be more activist on this issue, this is a really tough nut to crack. And because this is a regional and isolated conflict, so far the conflict has largely, although there have been some incidents in the West region, has been largely contained in the Northwest and Southwest regions, has been largely affecting only one ethnic, or not so much an ethnic, but a cultural minority made up of other small ethnic groups, but really a cultural minority in a specific and mostly contained region. So it's not what you might call a civil war specifically. It's not a very broad-based conflict. The death count, while devastating, has not been as high as, say, conflicts in Eastern Congo or Sudan that garnered a lot more international attention. And so it has remained somewhat on the back burner of the United Nations. It has remained not a super high priority for the American government, although there have been some statements, there have been some attempts at putting pressure on the government. But I will say that I agree that in general, it has amounted to very little, and the Cameroon government led by Paul Biya has been extremely stubborn.
And I think I'll add that the United States attitude can also be linked to the French policy, or to the French, the fact that this Cameroon is a French territory, like for quote unquote. So the US can only go so far, because you have these unwritten rules about who's in charge of what and how far you can go without the acknowledgement or the acquiescence of the other party. And we've seen this over the years, going back again to the 1990s, when the French drew a line and you had an activist American ambassador, Francis Cook, who wanted to go all the way in terms of kicking out Biya, but the French drew the line and said, this is a pré-carré, this is our territory, so back off. And the same attitude continues. As long as the French are not willing to play an active role in de-escalating the situation, the United States can only go so far within the context of Cameroon. There are other situations where the United States will ignore whatever the French think, but in terms of Cameroon, they can't ignore that. And then within the United Nations, you have countries like Russia or China that have always been roadblocks. As soon as any talk of an international mediation or anything is mentioned, the French or the Chinese or the Russians say, oh, guess what? It's an internal conflict, and which is a song that the Cameroonian government is singing. It's an internal conflict. We will solve it. But they're not solving it because the hawks are in charge. And they believe that victory is around the corner. And we're where we are.
Yeah, 5 years later.
That's right.
So, do you think, has there been, Cameroon have been asking asylum in third countries such as Brazil, or the only places where they think is going up north to the US?
You're saying have folks settled in other countries?
Yes.
Along the way?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I mean, I think that the country that folks have settled in most has been Mexico. I think in large part due to the fact that folks were stuck there due to various travel restrictions that were imposed both by the US and Mexican administrations. However, I think by and large, due to the reporting that we've read, as well as the human rights reporting that we did while in Mexico, folks have overwhelmingly stated that they had no interest in settling in Central and South American countries that they passed through, in large part due to the widespread anti-Black racism and lack of protections available for folks. There was a period towards the end of 2019 where the Mexican government was giving many Cameroonians, legal permanent residents in Mexico, with cards that stated that they were stateless. Of course, we know that these are not stateless individuals. They do have a country of origin, but it was just a way to sort of fast track legal permanent residents in Mexico and stop these individuals from accessing asylum and immigration protections in the United States. And as a result of that sort of forced or misled process through which individuals received permanent protection in Mexico, they've experienced really extreme difficulty now successfully seeking asylum in the United States because they were sort of tricked into a process in another country. So I think most times that we've seen folks settling in these Central and South American countries are through these sort of processes where, due to language barriers and intentionally misleading African migrants, they're granted a status that they did not actually seek. We've also seen, I think, due to the visa restrictions that have been imposed and perhaps maybe the general indifference of US administrations towards the conflict in Cameroon, that folks have not really been interested in seeking status in the US either. A lot of folks have continued on to Canada successfully. So that's also like a really
From where? From Mexico to Canada?
From Mexico through the US and then Canada,
okay.
if able to leave detention in the United States without being deported, they have successfully gone on to Canada, which you still encounter different migration issues there, depending on what status you had in the United States before entering into Canada. But we are doing research now about the growing number of Black migrants sort of bypassing the US and entering Canada to seek permanent status there.
Thank you, Sue. The question that we have here is there a solution to this crisis, and what each panelist can suggest?
Is there a solution? I'm sure each side will tell you what the solution is. The independentists will say, well, give us our nation. And the government will say, well, we want to stay one and indivisible. And that's why this conflict has lasted for 5 years. There was a time, probably 2016, when everybody was kind of at the center. It could have been resolved. And unfortunately, the hawks took over and violence and extremism came in, and the parties are so far apart that the solutions are there. You have the extremist solution. Either you have a state, or you have Cameroon the way it is, or you have federalists who say, well, it's okay, we want a state, but we can deal with a federal system. You have all this, and you have a lot of people in between. But the government has not even chosen to move from its position to accommodate either the federalists, much less the independentist forces. So yeah, there's a solution. There are solutions. There are beginnings of solutions, but no one, particularly the government, is making an attempt. If you read every statement that the government has made this year, it's like, we have pockets of resistance. We are winning. The conflict is over. They are just pockets of resistance. But these pockets of resistance are significant enough that they are causing all these disasters, all these migrations, all this displacement, all these deaths. But no one cares because they are only pockets of support, of resistance. So the war goes on. So every negotiation starts somewhere. You have to sit down and put your cards on the table. That we have to start from there, and then you come with your extremist positions and you find a middle ground, or you don't find a middle ground. There are talks. All conferences or conflicts that have been solved took a long while. There are conflicts that took, if you go to Vietnam, there were a series of conferences between the Viet Cong and the US for years, dragging on before there was a final solution. So there's no one magic bullet, or there'll be a conference in Yaoundé today for 5 days and the conflict is solved. But the parties have to come together. That's why the term inclusive dialogue, it's become a cliche, but that's really it. There has to be an inclusive dialogue of all parties sitting around the table and saying, so exactly what do you want? What can you give up? This is what I want. This is what I can give up. And you start there. But we are far from that point at this. People still want to fight on the battlefront. The government thinks it's winning and that victory's around the corner, so we're where we are.
There was a talk about Swiss mediation. Have you heard about this mediation, and where is the...
Yes, there's a talk about a Swiss mediation that was supported by the Swiss government and promoted by a Swiss human rights organization, but that the government of Cameroon at some point seemed to be interested and then basically backed off. So yes, in principle, the Swiss talks are going on. I think there were a couple of meetings in Switzerland a couple of years ago. Now it's been 2 years or going more than 2 years, and there's been nothing. People still believe in a Swiss mediation, but nothing is taking place on the ground. The Swiss government has basically given up. The organization that was organizing it is frustrated. The Amazonian groups that were involved still hang on it, but really there's no Swiss negotiation. There's no Swiss mediation. Those talks haven't gone anywhere.
Yeah, I
This
think
is encouraging.
I think that I agree with everything Debussy said. I would just sort of add that the only things on the horizon that might alter the state of affairs, perhaps not leading to a solution, but a change, perhaps even a complication of the issue, is Paul Biya's death. So President Biya is going to die. He can't live forever. So he has to die soon. So his death, and I would assume the next 5 years. I mean, who lives to be, much older than that these days and still governs? I'm not sure. So
you never know.
I know, you never know. You just be like the Energizer Bunny, but most people are anticipating some kind of, degeneration of his health or something that would make it difficult for him to govern sometime in the next 5 years. There isn't really a roadmap for a transitional government after him, but the Cameroonian government in the Francophone zone is trying to plan for various prime ministers or Paul Biya's son. There's different discussions about what might happen, but Paul Biya's death, or at least exit from the position of leadership, might allow some kind of transition to emerge, at least in terms of having the start of a long series of negotiations with the Anglophone region. The other, perhaps much more pessimistic outlook is what seems to be perhaps evolving now, which is a potential alliance with Nigerian separatists, Igbo separatist groups along the Nigerian border. So Nigeria's eastern border is home to a separatist movement of Igbo ethnic minorities, and there were some press conferences in which Igbo separatists and Anglophone Cameroonian separatists sat at the same table and announced that there would be cooperation in terms of weapons acquisition, fighters, strategy. I mean, perhaps it was a lot of bluff. I tend to think it was a little bit of a show to try and scare their governments, but that could be potentially quite complicating if there are cross-border Nigeria Cameroonian separatist movements that are cooperative or collaborative. Right now, they have not really collaborated, but that could certainly complicate things. The Anglophone separatists have not been able to acquire very sophisticated weaponry, thank God. They've been relying on rather simplistic weaponry and IEDs, explosive devices. And so that the military death toll has been low because the weaponry of the separatist movement has not been terribly sophisticated. So if that were to change, that would be dramatically, it would provide an even greater impediment to the peace talks. So, pessimistically, there's a potential for the greater escalation of violence and cooperation of separatist groups. Optimistically, there's a potential for the exit of an authoritarian leader who is completely ineffective and extremely unmoved on the issue of negotiating with the Anglophone cultural minority. So, hopefully the optimistic pathway is what will emerge, but there are some potential events on the horizon that could change the outlook for a resolution of this crisis.
Thank you. So, is there any pressure that you see from the civil society can exercise on? Because I mean, we'll see a lot of Cameroonian inside, outside, trying to do something about the crisis. And even those who want to do this pacifically, uh, yeah, it's true that, I mean, it seems that there's nothing that is happening, you know, do you see any pressure that can happen in Biya, or is only French that can make pressure for this?
Well, that's a tough one. Beyond the international pressure, I don't see I mean, the civil society can raise storm, they can write memos, they can mobilize and alert international organizations that are already aware of what is going on. But I don't think they can really move the needle. We are where we are right now and nobody's budget. And I think the pressure that might work, that has the potential to work, is pressure from other states. Now, if there was a concerted action, a concerted pressure from a series of states, that the states that matter, then we would say, yeah, there's a chance that that pressure might work in terms of economic sanctions, political sanctions, individual sanctions, I don't know, threats of military action. All of that is far-fetched, that there'll be a concerted international campaign in that direction. So I think until further notice, the government really has a free hand. The only limit to its action is the economic ruin that the conflict is causing. And that might determine how things turn out. I think there's more of a chance of the economy getting to a point where it's crumbling because of all the expenses that are being spent on this. But at some point, it seems like even that doesn't matter. As long as they're winning, as long as they're in power, the economic effects of this war are not being taken into consideration, because already the economic consequences of the war are severe, not just in the Anglophone regions, but on the national budget, the national economy, and everything. But it doesn't seem like that is a significant consideration. So I don't know where that international pressure will come from, because that concerted effort cannot take place. I mentioned earlier about the Russians and the Chinese, who are by Biya, even though not as active as the French. And then you have the French. So even at the United Nations, you cannot have the Security Council taking a unanimous stand on how to deal with Cameroon. So I think from that angle, I would say I'm pessimistic.
Right. A question for you, Thion. How the COVID has affected the migrant that you see, because you say that you're going to resume traveling to the southern border, to Mexico, and how this affected the migrant. I wonder, do you know if there's still a lot of migrants who are still coming through South America? I was reading the other day, I mean, the great article from the Pulitzer winner on the migrant from Cameroon to the Gap. It was, I mean, it's pretty sad. 2 to 4 months, you say yourself. I mean, it's it's incredible. So is there still people from Cameroon who are still facing the danger to come and use this way to come to the US?
Yes, so certainly Cameroonians do continue to flee and use the same routes that I expressed earlier throughout South and Central America to, seek refuge, either in the United States or another country. I think for now, due to the CDC order that I spoke about earlier, which sort of bars entry of all non-essential travelers at the southern and northern border, folks are unable to come into the United States and have sort of continued to wait in Mexico and other countries in anticipation that the borders will be reopening. It's also our expectation as advocates that the border will be reopening possibly as early as this summer. And so that means that that order that I spoke of earlier, the Title 42 policy would be lifted and sort of allow the individuals that have been waiting for so long, as well as the individuals that were expelled over this last year while Title 42 was in place, which is more than 500,000 individuals, to then return to the border and try to seek refuge at that time. However, as we talked about earlier, that simply means that a lot of people will likely be entering immigration detention, where they will likely face sort of similar harms and miscarriages of justice within our immigration system. There has been incredibly high numbers of credible fear interviews that are denied to Cameroonians, meaning that after they've made their claims for asylum, they're denied and deported back to their home country, despite the fact that the country conditions in Cameroon are pretty widely known and understood. And so, I mean, I think a lot of immigration advocates would say that there is a bit of prejudice against Cameroonian immigrants within our system for whatever reasons. I'm not sure what sort of advocacy will happen within the respective immigration groups that are active here in the US to sort of combat those sorts of discrimination that we've seen in the past as folks enter now, again, this summer into the following years.
Thank you, Sion. This is a very uplifting debate. I mean, and it's very heartbreaking to see that. I mean, whether you look, there seems to be no hope. So my question to you, Debussy, is there any, because we talk about the insurgents, we talk about the fighters, has there any talks about they're going to say, okay, they surrender, there's no more fight, or everybody has this position that, okay, we'll keep on fighting and we'll see what happens?
Yeah, I haven't heard of anybody talking of a surrender. Now you have the demobilization camps where fighters who are tired of fighting or who have been convinced to drop arms go for rehabilitation, as they call it. So we have those camps in Bamenda, in Boya, and I think in Kumba, I believe, but definitely Bamenda and Boya, where you have dozens or probably hundreds of reformed soldiers or soldiers who've abandoned the war. But in terms of groups actually giving up the fight, I haven't heard anything close to that. The groups on the ground want to fight, and they're still fighting. And there are lots of groups. A lot of these groups are, I always say this is a kind of a franchise war, in the sense that groups are inspired a lot by local conditions and local situations. So something might take place in a locality, and the people, individuals in that locality decide to form a movement. That's why whenever you hear those fighters, apart from those big groups, ADF and all those other groups that are known, you have little groups in different communities where you have groups fighting just within range of their community or their division, their region, their subdivision, their town, and that's where they are focused. So at this point, I don't think any group is thinking of giving up. Are there individuals who are giving up because of one reason or the other? Yes, but are there groups that are saying this is the end of the road? I haven't heard of any. They might disappear based on circumstances. They might disappear. There were groups there were names that we heard in 2017. We don't hear those names. The fighters have gone to other groups, or they've just walked away, or they're dead, but I haven't heard of groups that actually leave the battle ground. So I've said that the demobilization policy hasn't really worked. It hasn't been enticing enough for the fighters, and probably because they're starting, some will say they're putting the cart before the horse. Why not find peace, get some modicum of peace, and then you say, okay, now we are talking, can you come out of the bush? But you're asking them to drop their arms without anything in return. So it's not going to happen in a large scale.
Yeah. There's A question. There are many different groups of fighters on the Anglophone crisis, and there's all have their own requests. Are the Anglophone can sit together? Can the Anglophone sit together and participate on the debate on a case to be? And can they have the same representative?
What if you're talking about the general Anglophone population? I know, if I understand his question, we have people who they're federalists, they're separatists, they're regionalists, they're unitarists. Yeah, you have a wide range of people. But if you want to talk, it goes back to that cliche, the all-inclusive dialogue. Yes, you can bring those people together to talk. It doesn't mean that someone will convince someone immediately, because I think a lot of people are looking for a quick fix solution. You bring everybody together and in one weekend, we have a common solution. You'll never have a common solution, even in, whether it's in South Sudan, whether it was the South African groups in South Africa or Zimbabwe, you never had a single all-encompassing position. You had different, the ultimate goal everybody knew, but people had different approaches, different perspectives, different ideologies. So the Anglophone case is not different. I think once you get to that point where people are comfortable enough to come together to talk, a lot of these issues will solve themselves. But talking now from a theoretical perspective, it looks daunting or impossible, but I don't think it is. Bring them together, let's see what happens.
Thank you, Dibusi.
You're welcome.
So, to wrap up, because time is passing, I would ask for all the panelists, each of you, do you can offer any hope or any perspective or any last thought regarding this internal conflict, which is actually also international in some aspect?
Yeah, I would say that my only quick comment, and then I probably have to sign off. I'm sorry, I have a child crying in the other room. I think some hope is that there is a lot of exhaustion on the part of many Anglophone civilians with the conflict, and there has been some resistance to the separatist fighters. So some Anglophone civilians have turned in separatist fighters to the government or have denounced them to the police. I wouldn't say there's a broad scale grassroots cooperation with the government to try and stop the separatists from, continuing their insurrection. But there does seem to be a lot of discussion among civilians about how to try and move forward, how to try and bring, what do they call, demobilization, to demobilize the separatists. The government has demobilized some separatists with varying degrees of success. I think that there are some glimmers of hope. And another glimmer of hope is that the diaspora has stopped funding the separatists. So one of the reasons why the separatists have tried to reach across the border to Nigeria to try and cooperate with Nigerian separatist groups is because they are receiving less funding from abroad. And so the Anglophones abroad have stopped sending money. They do not want to be associated with or supporting the violence caused by separatist fighters. And so there's really a turn against the insurrectionists. And I think some of the more hardliners, I believe some of the hardliners could be brought to a more moderate position as they see the civilians sort of losing passion and losing their support from the civilians losing, the separatists losing support from civilians. I see that myself in the few Anglophones that I communicate with regularly. The exhaustion, the criticism, the internal criticism of the separatist movement, and some of the separatist leaders. So I would hope that some of that criticism reaches the ears of some of the more hawkish and hardline separatist fighters.
My perspective is, I agree that there's an exhaustion in terms of, with regards to the war, and there's also frustration with the divisions and the acrimony between the different groups. But the fundamental problem is that the basics of the Anglophone problem haven't been addressed. And the government is not making even the slightest of efforts to address those issues. And then the army, we have this army that is always on the rampage. And even when something might be a mistake, instead of just saying, we're sorry, this was a mistake, blah, 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 they always come up with this outrageous scenarios of what happened. And so even though a lot of communities are tired of the separatists, they are equally as tired or even more with the soldiers. So we're back to square one, that we need to find a solution. If the government doesn't want to talk to the separatists, then let it start addressing the basic issues that started this conflict. They are not. I think, yes, the separatists have committed some atrocities and stuff, that's fine. But I think the burden is really on the government and the military. What are you doing in these areas? There's a power vacuum. And sometimes when we use this term, amber boys, it's a generic term that covers even criminals who are doing stuff under the guise of a revolution. These are not part of any movement. We saw the same thing in the north, where the Cooper, the root, as they call them, the highway robbers, suddenly became Boko Haram. No, these are highway robbers who've been around for ages. In Anglophone Cameroon, you've always had these thugs. They'll tell you Kumba is an unsafe place. There are areas in Kumba where you can't go. There are areas in Tiko where you can't go. And it's the same thing now. But the government is convenient to just say, oh, well, those were Amber boys. The Amber boys have done something. They are terrorists. And it muddies the waters. And we can't get a clear sense of what we're analyzing. So I think for this situation to get the beginnings of a resolution, the government has to step up its game. That doesn't mean the separatists should just sit back and wait, but the onus is really on the government to take the lead and set the basis for this all-inclusive dialogue. The term is a cliche, but it's one that has the keys to the solution.
Thank you, Debussy.
You're welcome.
And Sion, any glimpse of hope?
I think one thing that I'll offer, and Doris and I spoke about this briefly prior to the webinar, is that temporary protected status is something that this administration, the Biden administration, can do right now for Cameroon. As part of the Black Justice is Our Justice campaign, advocates wrote a letter calling for both DED, which is deferred enforced departure, and TPS, which is temporary protected status for Cameroon. TPS could provide Cameroonians with the opportunity to remain in the United States, given that the current status of Cameroon is unsafe. And so the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security can easily designate a country for TPS if the country meets the requirements regarding ongoing conflict, which it clearly does here. So I think that's one thing that locally, just folks in the diaspora thinking of ways to help and advocate for folks who are suffering back home. That's one thing that we can do.
And how would you do that? I mean, they contact your organization, write to your congressman, senator to push for that?
Yeah, so they can contact Baji. That is one organization that they can reach out to. They can also look in deeper into the Black Justice is Our Justice campaign and the organizations that are supporting that campaign for more details about Cameroonian TPS or DED.
Okay, excellent. So I guess that there's no further question. If there's any question from the audience, otherwise, or any remarks that the panelists you might have.
I think we've covered enough ground. At least I have.
Thank you to everyone. I thought this was extremely informative. Thank you, Sion and Debussy.
Thank you. It was informative too. And hope the panelists and the guests, participants all learned something today from all different perspectives.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Doris, for moderating such an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.
And to the African Affairs Committee for sponsoring.
Yeah, thank you so much. You as a distinguished member of African Affairs Committee. It's very nice to have you and give us such important information. And I mean, we'll circulate. I mean, if people want to have the detail and the contacts of Baji or other organization, because I mean, a call for action is also what we do at the African Affairs. If we're going to talk to our members, or if we need to write a letter, advocacy letter or other things, we'd love to do that. And thank you so much, Debussy. Thank you so much, Professor Walker Said, for being here. Since last year, we contacted you for this event. Thank you for your patience, and thank you so much, Sion, for your help and your information on the situation of Cameroonian in the southern border of Mexico. Thank you so much for the attendance, for being here, and thank you for your questions. And talk to you soon.
Until next time.
Bye. Nice meeting you all.
Meeting you all.
Bye.